What were the biggest misconceptions about sex workers that you've found? Whenever you talk to people about what you used to engage in, what are the biggest kind of misunderstandings and misgivings that people have?
Oh, that's a very loaded question. I think one of the biggest, and the reason why I say it's loaded is because depending on what camp you're in, whether you're more comfortable having this conversation or you're more all sex work is evil. I mean, that's where I'm saying it's very loaded. But I think the biggest misconception really is that sex work is just full service work. And there are so many nuances to what sex work is. I mean, it's everything from stripping to selling fetish photos, which is the feet photos. It's phone sex, which still exists. Even in today's generation, it still exists. To doming, to so many different things that I think people just jump to it's all prostitution, it's all full service, and trying to really get people to understand the nuances. And I remember hearing once someone who was working for a nonprofit in sex work rights, and she was saying that you, as in everybody, knows a sex worker. Whether they've disclosed that to you or not is how safe they feel with your reception. So somebody at some point in their life, in their life, in your life, has had that exchange of sex in one way, shape, or form for some type of monetary value. So,
Gotcha. So I do want to get a little philosophical with this and ask
sure.
what primarily is sex. But before we turn to that, since we've just talked about somebody in my life or somebody in somebody's life
Mhm.
being a sex worker, and we're also defining sex worker in kind of a broad statement. It's not just
Yes.
people who, are selling the physical aspect, if that's a respectful way to put it, but people who are engaging in phone sex, people who are selling fetish photos. Does OnlyFans count as sex work?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. I would describe it, in my humble opinion, it's more of that arousal factor. So that could be something that is seemingly mundane. I've worked with somebody who had a balloon fetish. And so, I mean, something that is balloons, but it's how the balloons are manipulated that achieves that arousal. So that I think is really the defining marker of that. Um, but yeah, that answered your question.
It
Sorry.
does. No,
Yeah.
because the thing is, we've gotten to a place where a lot of the specifically women in culture right now, especially in young adult culture, are turning towards OnlyFans.
Mhm.
And so there's that the peculiar situation in terms of the romantic setting of like, hey, I want to date people, but I'll be dating an OnlyFans model type of thing. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of stigma with that. And that's why I want to add that layer on very
Yeah.
early on, because I do want to unpack that and figure out what that stigma is, where that's coming from, if you've experienced that stigma as well, and how to get out of that. Wh-
Yeah.
Just to start off, like what do you think that stigma is?
I,
It's just like this uncomfortability with that.
I think it's just that likening everything in the sex work umbrella to full service work. And when you are using a platform like OnlyFans, and there's so many others, so I don't want to just necessarily limit it to that type of that name because there are so many similar platforms. But that's the McDonald's of the group. So there's so many different ways in which a content creator can engage on there. And it could just be risque photos. It could be more where it's just whomever is modeling. It could be involving some other toys. It could be involving other people. And so where that is up to the content creator. And of course, I think as someone who may have, when you're talking about dating, may have consumed the information from platforms like that. And you're just focusing on, oh, she was just totally in a gangbang. Like, that's how all content creators are. How can I date someone like that? And that's not what everything is. And to really understand the nuance behind that. And also why we sex workers do what we do. I mean, and it's the reason is very, very different. And I've been a sex worker in a few different ways. And it's, I kept coming back to it because of the social work aspect. I always liken sex work to social work. It's really, really therapeutic. I would joke that, like, the orgasms, that low barrier of entry, and I would see hyper masculine men who, they don't trust anyone, military, law enforcement, like, just don't trust anyone, coming to me in a very vulnerable state, wanting to be tied up, caged, put in lingerie, all of these types of things. And I saw it as such a gift that I get to see what 99% of the world doesn't get to see. But that's not what's discussed when we're talking about sex work. It's just the taboo. It's just the fetish. It's just the, how can we push the line? And so to really understand that there is nuance in sex work, that there is different reasons for why a sex worker is coming into this work, and really having those types of authentic conversations are super, super important, especially when we're talking about dating, but just in the culture in general.
Yeah. There's three ways I want to go. I'm gonna see if they. I want to
But
see
don't
if they
cheat.
tie up. Yeah. Um, you talked about why sex workers do what they do.
Yeah.
And so I think you already answered the social work aspect. Is there more to that? Like, did you have this drive to do this from before, or did it just come about
Well,
as it did?
when I was stripping when I was 21, back in the day, a long time ago,
A
at
couple
that
years
point,
ago.
yeah, just a couple. Um, Back then, yeah, it was like, I'm young, I'm 21, like, I'll make this money, like, that was a very different conversation back then. And then I saw what it really was. Because, well, for me, and now, of course, every individual who's in sex work is experiencing something very, very different for a lot of reasons. For me, I was seeing, because this was early 2000s, mid 2000s, this wasn't social media everywhere. Like, you were actually engaging with clients, you were having real conversations. I was talking to people that were on the road all the time and really just wanted that connection. And that's how I saw, this is therapeutic, this is social work. So I didn't come in knowing that. But sex workers will tell you it's social work. They will tell you a lot of what they do is listening, whether it's, oh, my marriage is horrible, or, oh, I have all these problems with dating, or all these other things. There's still that listening aspect to it. So it started as, I'm gonna get this money and just taking full advantage of my age and all that stuff. And then I really saw what it was. So yeah, it can be a mixed bag too. People, can really enjoy the money and want to help people as well.
With OnlyFans, again, I don't want to equate these two things,
No,
but
it's okay.
just to use it as kind of like a cultural placeholder so people have some
Yeah,
bookmark to come back to.
because that's the
Um,
big thing right now. And I think, yes. So yeah.
as soon as you find out that a female engages with OnlyFans, you just look at her as that,
Yep.
right? She's an OnlyFans model. And then there's a lot of disrespect and negligence and just dislike for
Yeah.
folks that do that.
Yeah.
Did you also experience this as well? Because the question I'm getting to is it becomes your entire persona.
Hmm.
It becomes like, oh, not to use your name, but like Sarah is X. Sarah is just a sex worker. And not only does that happen with a job title, like people ask after your name, like, what do you do? And then if the job is cool or high paying, then they treat you a certain way. If
Right.
it's not, then they treat you a different way.
Hmm.
But with sex workers, again, that stigma, that cultural understanding is like, you're just a sex worker now and you're, you know, again, not to, I mean, no offense with this, but like you're not as high up in
Right.
terms of the social hierarchy.
Mhm.
How did you navigate this and deal with this? Is this also what you experienced as well, or did you experience something
Oh,
differently?
yeah, I definitely did. And I typically, it wasn't, I don't know, how's the best way to respond to this? It's one of those situations where I typically gravitate towards partners who have a certain value system, and that's being open minded in general. Now, when you're doing the initial communication, that is limited in a certain way, and so you may not know the full extent. But I'm going to weed out people who are very traditional in certain ways. And so, because I know that you're not going to accept me, regardless of what the work is, you're not going to accept me and my beliefs and my values in general. So I tried to weed those people out. However, life happens. And I've had some interesting conversations. And it's really about educating and just trying to shift the perspective. I mean, clearly, we're not going to work out in a dating situation, but I want you to leave this brief encounter, this brief coffee, or this brief situation having a different perspective so that the next person that you encounter will hopefully have a little bit more tolerance of your tolerance, or you won't necessarily you may start to question some of the things that you believed about before, and shifting your perspectives in general, and whether that's somebody that you date or just somebody that you encounter in a social setting at a party or what have you, or just the stuff that you're seeing right now, because it's everywhere. And in the States specifically, with all that's being cracked down on around sexual and reproductive health rights, just shifting your own mindset. So it's just an opportunity to have a conversation. Can be very frustrating, especially when you're getting attacked. But I mean, emotion, verbally, not physically. But yes.
I got you. And not just not physically, but verbally and spiritually and mentally and emotionally as well. There's
Yeah.
there's also a very probably emotional toll that you have on the job. People are coming to
Yeah.
you, they're being super intimate. You're calling it therapeutic, but what we, I think, don't acknowledge is that therapists have a big emotional toll because they are human and they have to deal with all of these things. What was that emotional
Yeah.
toll like? You didn't sign up for that emotional toll at the jump, but you have to deal with it as you're going through it.
Yeah, there's a shelf life, and that's why I came into different modalities at certain times in my life. Um, it's varied based on the level of interaction, based on the emotional toll that it will take, all of those types of things. And you really need to know your boundaries. Whether you are a traditional therapist, you're a sex worker, you're doing whatever you're doing where there is that raw emotion of humanity, you really learn your boundaries very, very quickly. And if you don't, your burnout is through the roof because you're constantly being attacked. You have people that are constantly pushing, um, especially as sex workers, because you're only seen as a sex worker. You're scum of the earth. And so they'll continually push and continually push and continually push. So you need to know who you are, what you will do, what you won't do, what your boundaries are, all of those things, and really need to be solid in that, or you'll get eaten alive in this profession. Whether that's, for a short period of time, as a career, what have you, this is something that you need to really know your boundaries. You really need to know who you are, and you're going to be triggered all the time. All the things that you thought you dealt with, and that's again in the therapeutic realm in general. That's traditional therapists. That's anybody who's again dealing with those raw emotions. You're continually being triggered, and you need to figure out how to handle that. But you see the best of humanity and you see the worst of humanity, and it's still beautiful. So,
How did you market yourself and build a clientele in that way? Because with therapists, like I found my therapist online.
Yeah.
I just searched up therapists in Montreal. How do you do the same thing for sex work? Is there certain sites you can go to or?
Yes, and it varies by where you are, and it varies by country. So not just where you are in terms of city-wise, but country, what the rules are. Um, and so just depending on what type of work you're engaging in, um, it's very it's very different. If you are full service, it's very difficult in the States, especially since there's that crackdown on trying to prevent trafficking, which that's a whole nother issue on if you're really concerned about sex trafficking, you also need to be really concerned at the porn that you're watching because, ethical porn is there for a reason and paying for it is actually worth it. But there are different sites, depending on the type of work that you do, to be able to market yourself. And the one big thing is you have to run it like a business. So you actually have to respond to people. You have to have that engagement. You also have to, once you have that established client or clientele, know your boundaries because they're going to continue to push it in terms of not just what I was referring to before, as in, I want to take it this much further, even though you're, let's say, not comfortable with me actually orgasming. I want to orgasm, even though you've told me no, I want to, like just those types of little things. But when you have that established clientele and you have that relationship, the fantasy can sometimes be muddled. And knowing your boundaries in terms of whether you are open to dating clients, which is a very slippery slope for a lot of reasons, or whether you're not, and how you handle that when it's pursued a lot more. And especially if you're doing in-person work, they know who you are. This is not like you can really hide in some way, but doxing is a thing. So, it's still it's very, very risky. So there are sites that you can market yourself and build your clientele, but there's a lot of stuff around that as well. So
Well, I mean, I would love to double tap on that if
yeah,
you're comfortable with talking about like that slippery slope, because obviously if sex is involved in some way, like however we define sex, which I will get to, I
okay,
promise. I asked in the
yeah,
beginning. Um, Obviously emotions are also involved, no matter what type of person you are. Eventually, emotions are
yeah.
involved. Uh, how do you deal with that? Was it more of the client getting attached
Yes,
to you, or were there instances where you getting attached to the
it's
client?
clients getting attached to you. And I remember talking to a friend once who engaged in full service work because it was legal in his area. And he knew he could talk to me about this. And he was saying, "Oh, this is what happened at my last encounter." And I had to keep telling him that she's acting, even though you think she's not and you want to believe she's not. I'm like, I don't want you to get hurt, but you have to remember to not mix the fantasy with the reality of this. And he's like, I'm not. I'm like, you are. And I'm trying to stop this right now because this is going to be bad. You're going to get hurt, and not that I think that he would necessarily do anything to her, but for some, this could be very risky for the person who is the sex worker. And so and this is kind of going back to what I was saying about that orgasms, that low barrier of entry. There's that vulnerability right there. And, as sex workers, we're acting, you know, hate to break it to you. We're not like, this isn't real. Like, we are acting. And so we have that barrier. We have that buffer. The person who's coming, that client, does not. And that's where things can get muddled. So, yeah.
And how did you deal with the difference between your work persona and your personal identity? Where did that start and end? How did you develop that mask even? And did it feel weird? Did it feel like, on the one hand, you're trying to provide a
Mhm.
therapeutic service, but on the other hand, it's not you,
Yeah.
essentially.
I'm going to be honest. It's tough. It's tough because I'm such a genuine person that a lot of, even when there is that bit of a mask, there is that bit of a barrier. Like I don't want to hurt anybody. And I want, I mean, we all know it's a fantasy, but at the same time, it can get so muddled, like I was saying. And it's just, that's something I really struggled with. And that's why I've, been in and out. And again, the different modalities, because it's hard for me to be able to not just be me, like the real me all the time. So yeah. I know others don't have that problem necessarily, but like I know I just, I do. So
So speaking of others, what was the sex worker community like? Is it very competitive or supportive?
I'm going to actually liken it to sex tech overall because the space I'm in now is more sex tech. It's working in a bit of a different way. And I would say those of us, and so just to define sex tech, it's services or products that are relating to sexual health. And so that's anything from vibrators to your sex therapist to your sex workers to all the other stuff. So um, it's, I would say, super, super supportive. And the reason why I would say that, now, of course, there are the exceptions, but I would say because we know how stigmatized our work is, everybody else there is against us, but in our community, we're super, super supportive. Now, when you are, let's say, dancing, when you are in a strip club, um, that's very, very different than other forms underneath the sex tech umbrella. And so that can get a bit competitive. Um, but this is what I always say, it's not about the competition because I'm not for everybody. You're not for everybody. And so, depending on what the client is looking for, I'm not the person that's going to just, like a 10-minute thing. Like, I'm not that person. I'm the relationship person. I am more, yeah, we'll do whatever, but I want to hear about you. And I want to be able to still have that. And that's, some people just want the 10-minute thing. And so there's so many other wonderful individuals that can service that. And so I think really understanding that, whether you are in the strip clubs or anything that could be perceived as a bit more competitive, just remembering that, you know, we're all here to help each other. We're all here to support each other. And again, in sex tech, that umbrella, it's a little bit more understood. But when you're standing on your feet for hours and hours and hours and all these things, and you're seeing other ladies getting, the tips and going to the back rooms and doing all these things and getting the money, and you're just like, you know, okay, so I only have $20 to show for an 8-hour shift. Like, you know what I mean? And that's when it can really start to wear on you. But to remember that um, you're there to support each other. And it's just, it doesn't have to be about competition, collaboration.
It's
Yeah.
it's collaboration. And did you have any mentors or guidance when you got in the industry or as you were going through it, or did you have to
It
navigate
was
it alone?
interesting. I never thought I was going to be a Dom. I had, so going back to the dating thing, oh, this is so bad. This is such a bad story, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So, um, it was supposed to be just like a potential romantic date. And that's when the conversation progressed. And as we were going through the dating, he's like, you should really do this. And that's how he got me into being a Dom because it was it was my client. He became my client, like my first client, because he was like, this is what you're good at. And I used to joke and be like, I'm just super angry and I'm just all these things. And, I'm not a dumb, I don't have enough leather, like, things to aspire to, but like all this stuff. And I would joke about how I would intimidate men and how all of these things. And, I didn't realize how that was going to carry over, but to have someone as a client see me in that. And so it's kind of like a mentorship in a weird way. It's just it was interesting because I didn't expect things to transpire that way, and yeah, they did. So
And what about your mental health in all of this? How did you stay mentally healthy and continue to keep yourself grounded?
I was a mess in my 20s. I was an absolute mess. I was very, very angry. I joke that my teens were about survival, and my 20s were about the education and all that type of stuff. And my 30s were building my business and those types of things. But my 20s, I still hadn't dealt with everything from my teenage years, and so I was very angry at others, at myself, and so my mental health was not great. When I came back to sex work in my 30s, though, things had started to shift, and I'd started to really unpack the healing because I wasn't so focused on school from my 20s. Like I'd gotten through that. And part of the things as a business owner is that, you get triggered, all this stuff, but it's also a healing journey. And so you have to deal with these things. So my 30s were a lot better, and I was able to approach the therapeutic end of sex work in a lot more positive of a way versus my 20s, because I was a mess. And seriously, what 20-year-old's not? So, for a variety of reasons. So, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
true. I'll hide the fact that I'm 24 and move on to the next question. Um,
But you addressed the fact that you had a therapist. So, like, you addressed these issues that, hey, I need support. I can't just do this alone. And that's now, of course, again, different generation. But when I was in my 20s and others in their 20s, from my generation, we didn't deal with that. We're like, something for later. But your generation's a lot more proactive around these things. And so that's great that you are addressing the stuff.
what's the
So,
difference between our generations in addressing those things? Is it because I could just search up trivially therapists near me and get online within the hour, whereas you guys had to do the brick and mortar thing of going and, you know, waiting room and all of that and seeking them out in that type of way?
yeah.
Or is it something else?
I think that's part of it, but I think the bigger issue is we came from the generation of everything's just swept under the rug. And because it was analog, initially, um, there was more time spent on stuff. So it's kind of like, turn of the century, last century, when you I have to explain that now, turn of the last century, when you had to do all the washing yourself and you had to walk everywhere and you had to do all these things. So you didn't have time to focus on stuff like mental health. Like, who's got time for that when you've got 1,000 kids and you've got to do all these things yourself? And that's part of it, of just sweeping it under the rug. We don't have time to deal with this. But as technology has made life easier in some ways, there's that accessibility part of being able to just text a therapist. But there's also, we have more time to deal with these things. But also, I think what I feel like your generation may get a bit of a bad rap of like, well, what have you really dealt with? You've dealt with so much. Like, thank God I'm old. Cyberbullying and all this stuff. Like, I can't imagine growing up and, being a teenager with all these issues. And so you really need to face it. We could mask it and just be like, yep, swept under the rug. Deal with it later. Whereas your generation really has had a lot to deal with.
Are we dealing with it well, according to you?
I think you're trying with the best that you can. I think, unfortunately, it depends on how you were raised. Hurt people hurt people. And depending on how your family was structured, um, if there was that more nurturing, or if it was more, just I'm having this child because I'm trying to heal my own wound. And I'm speaking of that from my mom. It was very much, I want a child because I can always have this child to love me and care for me and all these things, which is not the reason to have a child. So I think it's that environmental stuff that's a big factor that every generation has to deal with. But with everything that you're facing, you're trying to deal with, especially with porn being everywhere. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's actually a little bit younger than you. He's 20, and he was talking about how when he first got exposed to porn, like he's like, I wasn't even like seeking it out. It was just coming in. And so with what you've had to deal with, you're doing it in the best way that you can. And each generation has to figure out what's best for them with all the changes that keep happening with technology and just life in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we are dealing with this abundance of porn, but I don't necessarily think that you find porn just on an adult website, let's
Right.
say. I think you find porn on Instagram,
Yeah.
find porn on billboards outside. And also, you find porn very, very young. Like I found porn when I was 10. And so there is that kind of like
Yeah.
digital molestation that
Yes.
happens where, you're forcing very young, like creepily young children to watch other people do those things. Where do you think this porn thing goes? Because we so this access to porn is not new.
Mhm.
Obviously, in your generation, there was the Playboy magazines, and you could rent porn out, and there was a lot of friction.
The
But
back room at the movie theater with like the beaded curtain. That I know nothing of what I'm talking about, but just memories.
it was there,
I
right?
was there,
You were
yes.
able to access it.
Yeah.
And then now I can just click a few buttons and see whatever I want in any capacity for free forever. But there's still like I'm still holding something in front of me. But what happens when I have like the Apple Vision Pro and VR goggles and I can actually see the person, see the woman in front of or whatever I'm into, see them in front of me and now, with other toys and stuff stimulate actually being with them. Where does that go and how does that affect what we're talking about
It's
here?
so interesting that you mentioned this, and I'm really, really glad that you do because there are, I just saw something about this yesterday. Like there are, and it's not new, but what they were posting about was this is why we need to have this conversation. Sex doll, like the VR glass sex doll brothels, specifically in Belgium. No, sorry, Berlin. And they were talking about how you can request a doll that is covered in blood. You can request a doll that is all slashed up. And of course, the perpetuation, and no questions asked, the perpetuation of the violence against women. And so I think it's really a slippery slope because there are those who prefer the comfort of not having someone and just being able to escape in terms of like self-regulation, which becomes problematic when it starts to be, oh, okay, I want a relationship now, and there's all these other issues that come from, oh, this is an actual human. I actually need to take their thoughts and feelings into account. And
They're not like a sex toy.
and that's the problem with porn at such a young age versus sexual health education because you're not understanding like what consent actually is. And you're expecting whomever your partner is to be like those that are acting in the clips or films, or I almost said films, but I guess they're more clips, in the porn, you're expecting that level. And oh, they want this because this person loved it. I remember talking to a client, and he was really into cuckolding. And I was asking him about his interaction with his wife and how that conversation has gone. He's like, oh, no, I can't. He was from the Midwest of the United States, very conservative. And I was like, well, there's still ways to bring it up in a non-threatening way. And I was talking about how to introduce toys and have that type of conversation with the toys to start to introduce what you are wanting, that fetish that you are seeking, that you are going to a sex worker to fulfill, but to be able to have it in a healthy relationship. And he and I were having conversations about the sex toys, and he was sending me what he was thinking. And what we were talking about, an anal plug. And he sends me this glass anal plug that I think had like diamonds and stuff on it. And I was like, you've never done anal with your wife and you're going to show her that? No! But and he specifically said this, he's like, that's what the girls in the porns like. And so having these types of conversations on what the reality is and what the fantasy is, and all of these other issues, because it's one thing if you recognize it's still a fantasy, but when you're conflating that, that's the problem. That's where it's just, it can be very, very, very messy in a lot of ways. And this is why, we all are, but I think your generation especially, connected more than ever, but lonelier than ever. And I think a big part of that is also because you don't know how to have those real interactions, because all of your interactions in your generation have been through a screen. And so how all of this really looks in real life with real humans.
Well, how does that all really look for us in the next 2 to 5 years? Because now I actually don't need to have a human there. I can just use Replica or an AI chatbot to, be sycophantic and just, again, feedback loop for me. And I can generate through deep fakes a celebrity or literally anything that I want, doing anything. How do we have that conversation, first of all? So just before we answer that, did porn unlock something for us in the sense of like, did porn give us access to what we already wanted, what was already in our desires, or did porn generate those desires for us?
Oh, chicken and egg, huh? I think it's a little bit of both. And especially the accessibility of porn, it's being pushed. And especially the way porn feeds are on free sites. You may not have thought that you would want to see that, or you didn't want to see that, but the video starts and you're already like, it's this French is not a language I speak well, but basically it's the call of the void. That's the translation of the French. It's like when you're standing on the edge of a really high-rise building and there's just like that compellingness almost that you want to jump, but like it's that back and forth conversation, you know what I mean? And so it's kind of the same thing when you're seeing images that are just automatically starting on porn or things like that. So you may not have ever wanted to see that or think that you had the desire, but there's that call. And then all of a sudden you go down this slippery slope with that. And it's just, again, a mess. So, yeah, it gets muddled.
Let's inject some hope into this. How can Gen Z actually utilize porn in a healthy way? Is there a way to do that?
ethical porn. And so when people are like, what the hell is ethical porn? I liken it to, you know how there's fair trade chocolate. So fair trade, you know that the workers, from those that are picking the cocoa beans to those that are processing it, to those that are packaging it, to those that are shipping, all of those elements in the production of that candy bar are treated fairly. Their rights are being respected, all of those aspects. So ethical porn is like fair trade porn. So you have the knowing that when you are accessing this material, everyone is 100% consenting. You have emotional support staff on hand in the scenes before, during, after. You know that everyone is being paid a fair wage. You know that there is that ethical treatment. And so many times people are like, didn't know that existed, because it's not free. You have to access it, but you're paying to know that these are not sex trafficked individuals, that they are treated fairly, they are treated respectfully, regardless of what's going on in the scene. It's all willing participants, because, you know, fetishes, but it's all 100% above board. And so I think there is hope in this for, because and that person, the friend that I was telling you about, had access to porn when he wasn't searching it. Him and I've had this conversation about, well, is porn good or is porn bad? And of course, you know, things aren't black and white, but I wouldn't say porn as a blanket statement is bad. It has a purpose. It serves a purpose. It's just how you utilize it, what you're accessing, and all of these other variables. So I think there is hope because there are more ethical porn companies popping up. This conversation is happening. So we're shifting the narrative away from like the violence and the oppression and all of these other issues that are keeping you hooked, yes, but problematic as humanity. So there is hope. You know, I am an optimist. There is hope. So,
Love the
yeah.
optimism.
Yeah.
If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
I think it would be, you know, I always believe that the, you know, why are we here? Why do we exist? What is the meaning of life? It's love. And so really it's that connection with other individuals. And so if I had a magic wand, it would be that empathy, really having people understand, as we're relating it to this conversation, content creators are not just numbers. They are not just this image on a screen. There isn't that disconnect. They're people like you and me who need to go to the grocery store, that need to do the washing, need to do all the things that we need to do as humanity, who have feelings, who have thoughts, who have beliefs. And so to really understand a little bit more of what another person is experiencing, whether you agree with it or not, which actually it's a little bit better when you're, you know, facing somebody who you don't necessarily agree with. When you have that empathy and you have that understanding, it just shifts your perspective and makes you more loving and compassionate to yourself, but also to humanity in general. So empathy, that's my magical wand. So,
And as a last question, what gives you hope in the world?
that little thing of like, you know, somebody who just takes the time and cares about you, whether it's just a smile, a passing smile with somebody walking down the street, or somebody who really listens to you when you're having a bad day, whether that's somebody at the grocery checkout, you know, who's just doing your groceries and just listening to you, that magical person who was put in your path to just see you, hear you. And it's those little things that have that ripple effect that you may not know, smiling at somebody who's having a bad day, that you don't know that they're having a bad day, but you just smiling at them completely shifted their day because you don't necessarily know what their thoughts were and what their actions were going to be later that day. And so it's that ripple effect that happens. So that's what gives me the hope, is those little things that we take for granted that we don't realize that really make a difference in people's lives. So hopefully this also inspires your listeners to do more of those things. See people, hear people, and understand that we all have stories and we all deserve compassion.
Tiffany, you're a beautiful soul. Where can we find you online?
So I'm going to give you all the links and to put in the show notes on social media, website, all the fun things. So, yeah.
I can't wait to have you back on. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you.